The house and land on 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville on the south shore of Long Island, New York, is one steeped in a history of the paranormal. Looking back, it is not difficult to see why so many met an unfortunate fate on the property. It is a history that involves a considerable amount of anguish, demons, black magic, unexplainable poltergeist-like activity, and brutal murder. Little was known about the quiet house on Ocean Avenue prior to the Defeo family murder. The house was purchased by one John Moynihan in 1924, who tore down a cottage on the property and built a larger Dutch colonial home to accommodate his growing family. A few decades later, it was purchased by one Michael Brigante, who would essentially give the house to the Defeos. Before going into the murders, it's important to paint a clear picture of Ronald Joseph Defeo Sr., who was most likely the main reason for, and the first person killed, in the murders. He married Louise Brigante while the two were still teenagers. Louise's parents, Michael and Angela Brigante, both opposed the marriage and cut ties with the couple. However, that only lasted until Ronald Jr. was born, at which point Louise's parents started supporting them in every way possible, giving Ronnie Sr. a job working at their car dealerships. Ronnie Sr. did not make enough money to afford the house he purchased in Amityville, and the only reason they were able to stay there was because of the support they received from Michael Brigante, Louise's father, both from the job and through other large monetary contributions. By all accounts, the members of the Defeo family were living well outside their means, throwing lavish parties for the employees of the car dealership, installing an in-ground pool, and at one point commissioning a series of oil paintings of the family, valued at $15,000 each. Ronnie Sr. was a strict disciplinarian with his children, in particular with his first son, Ronald Jr., for whom he had high expectations. As family members have attested, one minute Ronnie Sr. would be hugging his son, the next minute he would throw him across the room. It's difficult to trust anything that Ronald Defeo Jr. says at any point during the investigation and trial. He was a troubled youth. Ronald was overweight as a child and frequently picked on. He didn't lose the weight until his later teenage years, when he started abusing amphetamines. As we already know, his father was abusive. Ronald Jr. frequently turned to and abused alcohol, marijuana, LSD, and heroin. Ronald Jr.'s temper was on par with that of his father. During the trial, he was formally diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. His story changed frequently, as did his official defense, from innocent to guilty to insane to under emotional distress. The evening that the bodies were discovered, November 14th, 1974, Ronald Jr. walked into Henry's bar in Amityville and spoke with some friends and acquaintances about his concern over not being able to contact his parents. He mentioned that he wanted to check up on them, but didn't have a key. He eventually left under the pretenses that he would break into his parents' house. Keep in mind that at this time, Ronald Jr. is 23 and living on his own, also supported by a job through his grandfather's car dealership. He returned to the bar some 10 to 15 minutes later, this time panicking, insisting that his parents had been shot. A small group of people then left Henry's bar in a hurry to confirm what Ronald Jr. already knew. Soon, police, investigators, and priests would be all over the scene. At first, Ronald claimed his innocence in the matter, insisting that this was the work of mafia hitmen. given his family's ties to the mob, it seemed a plausible story. While still at the scene of the crime, on the night of the murders, Ronald Jr. suggested Louis Fellini might have carried them out. However, Fellini had a solid alibi and was ruled out as a suspect. When further pressured, Ronald Jr. admitted to committing the murders. And upon further investigation, police noted that it would be highly unlikely that one person could have committed all of the murders within the time frame that the events took place. During the trial, Ronald Jr. claimed that his sister Dawn was the one insisting on murdering their father. She also suffered from their father's abusive tendencies, as did the rest of the children in the family. In this version of Ronald Jr.'s story, he killed their father and mother, but Dawn killed their other siblings out of fear that they would rat them out. Ronald Jr. thought their deaths were unnecessary, so he shot Dawn in retaliation. According to Ronald Jr., he initially didn't want to go along with his sister's plan, but after drinking and taking illicit drugs with Dawn, she was able to goad him into carrying out the murder. After examining the nightgown Dawn was wearing the night she died, investigators found traces of burnt gunpowder, which might indicate that Dawn had shot a firearm, though forensics later determined that wasn't the case. Much later, Ronald explained in a 1986 interview for Newsday that his mother had killed Ronald Sr. and her other children, but at the time he didn't want to admit that publicly because his great-uncle, Pete Defeo, was a capo for the Genovese crime family. He worried that any stain he put on the family name would put a target over his head. At one point during the trial, Ronald Jr. pleaded insanity, claiming that he heard voices throughout the house plotting against him. Though once again, his story was inconsistent, and it's hard to determine if this did or did not happen at any point around the time of the incident. Ultimately, Ronald Defeo Jr. was sentenced with 6 counts of second-degree murder and given 6 sentences of 25 years, which he is still carrying out to this day in a prison in upstate New York. While the murders that took place in Amityville were grisly, and may or may not be of a supernatural origin, the story of the house on 112 Ocean Avenue does not end here. The house remained on the open market for just a little over a year after the murders. Being in an upscale suburban neighborhood, the house was expected to sell much faster. The stigma of the murders kept anyone local from buying. Eventually, the price fell to $80,000. Enter the Lutz family. George Lutz was an ex-Marine and land surveyor. Kathy was a housewife, with 3 children from a previous marriage. They were originally attracted to the house for its low price, despite its prime location in an upscale coastal neighborhood. The Lutzes were aware of the murders, but decided as a family that they would be fine living on the property. As a precaution, they brought a priest to bless the house on the day they moved in. Upon entering a bedroom on the 2nd floor, the one belonging to Mark and John Defeo, 2 of the children killed the year prior, the priest had a strange experience. Of this experience, he said the following: "I was blessing the room. It was cold. It was really cold in there. I'm like, well, gee, this is peculiar. Because it was a lovely day out. And it was winter, yes, but it didn't account for that kind of coldness. I was also sprinkling holy water, and I heard a deep voice behind me saying, 'Get out.' It seemed so directed toward me that I was really quite startled. I felt a slap at one point on the face. I felt somebody slap me, and there was nobody there." The priest did not mention the experience to the Lutzes, but cautioned them not to use that room as a bedroom. The Lutzes heeded his advice and turned the space into a sewing room. But after a few days of living in the house, The Lutzes soon discovered that the priest's blessing did little to abate certain unexplainable negative forces. It only took a few days for members of the family to experience eerie chills. Other oddities began to happen as well. This included foul odors with no source, strange black stains appearing in various locations, as well as the appearance of a green gelatinous substance. In addition, some members of the family began to exhibit drastic changes in personality. The husband, George Lutz, stopped grooming himself, as he felt a constant chill in the house. He claimed he couldn't get warm, and spent much of his spare time stoking the fireplace. George would frequently wake up at 3:15 a.m., which is the time police believed Ronnie Defeo Jr. committed the murders. George's health, along with that of his wife Kathy, declined rather suddenly. One night, George awoke from his sleep to watch his wife suddenly age into an old hag. He watched as his wife aged in appearance by 60 or 70 years. Kathy was horrified, and it took several hours before her appearance returned to normal. The next night, she levitated several feet above the bed while lying down. The Lutz's daughter began spending all her time in her room, playing with an imaginary friend. She described it as a red-eyed pig named Jody, who could transform not only in shape, but size, at times becoming larger than the house. The daughter also claimed that Jody said she could not be seen by anyone unless she wanted them to. At one point, the inside of the garage was covered in a mysterious green ooze, which was only ever captured in this one photograph. The Lutz family tried on numerous occasions to contact the Catholic priest who first blessed the house, only to find the phones would cut out whenever they'd make the call. After failing to get the priest to return, the family took matters into their own hands. Armed with a crucifix, they walked throughout the house reciting the Lord's Prayer. A chorus of voices erupted in response, asking them to stop. The last night the Defeos spent in the house was supposedly the worst. It begins to sound more like poltergeist activity, with intense banging on the walls, furniture rearranging itself in their presence, and beds levitating. The Lutzes made one final attempt to contact the priest. This call went through, and the priest suggested they leave the house. This was the night they left in a hurry, leaving behind the vast majority of their possessions. With all that happened, it seemed odd that the Lutzes didn't try to move sooner, but by all accounts, George Lutz was a particularly stubborn man. They stayed in the house for 28 days. Another 20 days later, the famous paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren were called to the house by Marvin Scott, a news reporter who had previously worked with the Warrens. The Warrens then called in a team of reporters, investigators, photographers, and parapsychologists to conduct a thorough investigation of the house. The Lutzes refused to be involved with this process. Ed Warren was physically pushed to the floor while reciting a prayer in the basement. Lorraine Warren could sense the presence of a demonic entity. The research team discovered that the Shinnecock Native Americans had an enclosure for the sick and mentally ill on the property, many of whom died on the premises. The team also discovered that the house belonged to one John Ketchum, who was a practicing black magician who had a cottage on the land prior to the construction of the Dutch colonial in 1924. This long history of atrocities created an atmosphere attractive to demonic spirits and other malignant entities. The Warrens were also certain that this negative energy must have had an impact on both the Defeos and the Lutzes. During the investigation, Gene Campbell set up a camera on a tripod in a hall near the staircase in the Amityville house. The camera was set to take regular photographs of the scene throughout the investigation. There is only one photo with an anomalous image, the infamous Amityville ghostboy photograph. No children were on the scene during the investigation. Some claim the photograph looks similar to John Defeo, but a close analysis of the photograph reveals that the two children do not look remotely identical. Some of the investigation team think that this is a photograph of a demonic spirit playing tricks on those who enter the house. After seeing the photograph, Missy Lutz claimed that she remembers playing with that little boy in the house, but none of the other Lutzes recognize him. While most of the paranormal happenings surrounding the Amityville home took place in the 70s, a new chapter has opened up over the course of the past 5 years as Daniel Lutz, George's adopted son, now in his 50s, has come forth with new details regarding the events that took place in the household. Daniel did not have an easy life. He cited that he didn't particularly get along with his adoptive father, who was an ex-Marine, and particularly strict. He also insisted the children take the Lutz last name, which didn't sit well with Daniel. Daniel made it a point to try to get rid of George, so he, his mother and siblings, could move back in together. George was known to beat the children with a wooden spoon. Daniel left home at age 15, just 5 years after the family moved away from Amityville, taking residence in California. Daniel spent a portion of his life homeless, drifting through towns in the southwestern United States. Daniel spent numerous years in therapy, trying to cope with the events that happened during those 28 days. The most significant memory in Daniel's mind is an instant where the household garage started moving up and down on its own. Keep in mind this was not an electric garage with a door opener, but one that had to be lifted manually. The household dog Harry ran out and started barking frantically. It was on a short leash and tried to jump over a fence to move towards the garage and ended up hanging itself on the fence. Daniel had just enough strength at 10 years old to save the frantically struggling dog before it suffocated. On move-in day, Daniel mostly unpacked boxes. When he went to deliver a box to what would be the new playroom, he encountered hundreds of flies. This took place in December on Long Island, which means nothing of the sort should have been alive at the time. Daniel remembers killing the flies, going downstairs to tell his mother, and then returning to find no evidence of the flies ever having existed. Daniel also remembers seeing Jody in his sister's window from outside the house at night. He described it as looking like a cartoon character of an angry pig, with wolf's teeth and laser-like red eyes. When this happened, Daniel and George rushed up to Missy's room to find Missy unharmed, but the small child-sized rocking chair was moving on its own and did not stop of its own accord. Daniel was also possessed by something inhuman during his stay at Amityville. He was with his mother in the stairwell at the time. She stumbled forward, as if startled by something, claiming that something had scratched at her. Daniel says it was like an unseen force passed through her and entered his body, and he described the feeling of the contact as a numbness, like one would have after receiving an electrical shock, which would make sense if these beings functioned on an electromagnetic level. Daniel's body was thrown up the stairwell, some 15 feet, and then backwards into a wall. His mother rushed over to him, and they both heard a voice in a deep sub-bass tone, with gargling and crackling, saying, "It is you." At one point, a window slammed on Daniel's fingers so hard it shattered the bones, and completely flattened some of his fingers skin to skin. It took 3 grown men to lift open the window. While sitting in the kitchen with his mother getting some ice, Daniel witnessed a door open, and a spirit walked through, sat down at the kitchen table, and then disappeared. Prior to the spirit walking into the room, Daniel's hands had swelled to 5 times their normal size. After the spirit disappeared, Daniel's hands returned to normal as if nothing had ever happened, save for his left pinky finger. That finger is still kinked and misshapen to this day. Chief among the possible sources of causes for the happenings in Amityville are the spiritual practices of George Lutz. While in TV interviews, the Lutzes claimed to be non-practicing Christians who didn't believe in the occult or the supernatural. Testimony from family members reveals a different story. George Lutz's shelves were filled with books on occult subjects, ranging from telepathy, transcendental meditation, mind control, satanic history, hypnotism, demonic worship rituals, and rituals for sacrificing virgins, as well as other various religious texts. Prior to moving to Amityville, Daniel witnessed his stepfather levitate a wrench in the garage of George's previous house, while several of George's friends witnessed. Other family members have attested that George was the type of person who seemed to have a dark shadow following him everywhere. He wasn't particularly kind or sociable, and he certainly didn't do well with his adoptive children. Bobby Sylvester, one of Daniel's cousins, claimed their side of the family could notice all of this, and it caused their portion of the family to be quite anxious, worrying over what was happening. Given his occult dabblings and mean-spirited personality, it is quite possible that George was a catalyst for all of the events regarding the haunting of the Amityville house. His known history with the occult also may have been the reason George waited so long to move the family, in spite of all the odd occurrences. Ultimately, the estate on 112 Ocean Street in Amityville, New York, has attracted many unsavory characters over the course of its existence. Perhaps Daniel Lutz puts it best in his thoughts on what his experiences have taught him. I believe there is such a thing as evil, and I think that it can manifest itself in any way, shape, or form that it chooses at will, and I was a victim of that.